Hey, my name is Freedom Waffle. Today I'm here with Snake. We are going to do a deck tech on his top 4 Nymris deck. So Snake, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Snake. I'm one of the finalists of the latest Mox Masters here with Freedom Waffle. I guess I'm most famous for stifling your fetch on the first turn of the game. But, I'm my background in Magic, I'm a kind of PPTQ and SCG grinder, I guess, although the PPTQ system has now been replaced. But I kind of played Standard during that era, and I've come back to the game kind of recently because friends from my school introduced me to CEDH.
Fantastic. I think we'll just go ahead and show the audience a couple of those awesome moments from the top 4, the Stifle, and a couple other things. So here you go.
Sure.
Sorry about this. I'm gonna stifle your fetch.
Oh!
Deal. My drain.
Wow, I knew it.
Up 3. Toxic.
Oh,
I love you.
All right, awesome. So we're going to jump right in here and do a little bit of an intro to the deck itself. So what I would like you to do is if you can just tell me a couple of strengths and weaknesses of the deck, just so the audience knows like where this deck is going to excel and what metas.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest strengths of the deck is that you really get to participate in almost every game. The fact that very few, expensive cards in the decks are sorceries, and you're not going to be tapping out that much, and the fact that your commander has flat instant speed, it really means that you're less susceptible to some of these turn 2, everybody's there's a window open or nobody has mana up. But by being able to hold mana up and keeping counterspells up, you really incentivize longer games where you have the ability to make more decisions. And I think anybody who's kind of maybe tired of randomly losing the die roll or getting in 4th position and losing on a turn 2 or turn 3 win from a Turbo Grixis player or a Turbo Mardu player, they're going to like this deck as a nice change of pace because you're not incentivized to tap out for your Ristic on 3 and just immediately get punished. You're not incentivized to tap out for a Relic of Legends or something like that and put something that doesn't really impact the board onto the table only to just get punished for it just based on either somebody having an insane hand or a nuts key. And so every single one of my games in the Mox Masters really felt like I had a chance to win. And I think that's what a lot of people are going to find. You're going to lose a lot less games to just, I didn't even have a chance. I wasn't even a player in this game because you're taking a safer approach. And that's one of the unique parts of this deck. Fantastic.
Yeah, I know I myself don't like to play turn order simulator, so I love it. So what about the weaknesses? Like where does this deck fall short in what pods or what matchups do you find yourself struggling?
Yeah, so I think straight away we're only playing 2 colors, and that is a serious disadvantage in CEDH. Breach, Dockside are a hell of a Magic card, and we really feel that in this deck. Our average card quality is considerably lower than a lot of other decks. Additionally, we're playing Control in CEDH. This is not regular Magic where 1-for-1 counterspells is a legitimately good play. Every time we 1-for-1, we're putting us down in terms of card advantage at the table. And so you're really playing a archetype that doesn't lend itself to the format, and you're also playing worse cards on average. And you really have to utilize unique things that the Nymris can provide to take advantage of the deck.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And we saw that in the finals where you were trying to 1v3 us, and you did a fantastic job, but eventually 3 decks were able to finally shut you down. So
very hard to beat
absolutely.
3 draw steps.
Yes, it really is. Awesome. So what inspired you to play this deck?
So it was actually interesting. So I guess I'm going to take it from the beginning. I really wanted to target 3 decks. I wanted to target Kinnan, I wanted to target Tayam, and I wanted to target Sisay. I just think those 3 decks are very strong, very popular, and they have self-contained win cons built into the commander. I think they're very consistent as well. And so when you consider those 3 decks, I really wanted to play board wipe effects. Board wipe effects I think are really strong right now. They hit a lot of these creature-based decks, but the thing is, a lot of these blue decks have also taken up a lot of creatures in them. They're playing 15 plus creatures. And so board wipes used to be kind of dead in some of these matchups, but they're now making, they're not dead pieces of cardboard in these blue matchups, because these blue decks are playing a bunch of valuable creatures that they want to keep on the board. Stuff like Seedborn, stuff like, Archivist of Ogma, even, every deck's playing their commanders. So board wipes, I think, are really strong in this current meta, and that's one thing I wanted to play. Additionally, I really wanted to play Grafdigger's effects. Grafdigger's Cage and Weathered Runestone, they both shut down all those 3 decks I was talking about before, but they also just shut down green decks. Neoform, Eldritch Evolution, these cards just can't work well if there's a Grafdigger's effect in play. And, they also happen to shut down Underworld Breach, the best win con in the format. So when you take into consideration that they shut down basically all the green decks, they shut down random decks like Winota, or random decks like Kinnan, or like that just completely neuter the deck outright, and they also shut down like the Turbo Breach decks, I think Grafdiggers and Weathered Runestone effects are really strong in this current format. And so that's what I was looking to do. I wanted to play a deck that could utilize board wipes and utilize these two, the Grafdiggers effects. And so that's why I landed on Nymris. Nymris has the ability to, not play too many creatures that it cares about, or at least play around them because the creatures have instant speed. Additionally, she has the counter magic to back these things up. If you're playing a Grafdigger's Cage into a pod where 2 people hate the card, it's very likely that it's going to be blown up. And so having the counter magic to actually keep that effect in play is really important. And those are the 2 driving forces that actually led me to play Nymris. It wasn't, wanting to play at instant speed so much. It was really finding a shell that can utilize these effects properly.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think that's a really, really unique and cool approach, especially because the other Nymris archetypes that I've seen have all used their graveyard, because Nymris itself is a somewhat of a looting effect where it tosses half the cards you see into the graveyard. And so I've seen a lot of reanimator strategies, but the fact that you saw that meta call and decided that these stacks pieces were going to be more harmful to your opponents than what it did to your deck, I think that was a really smart decision. So definitely excited about that choice. So moving forward, who do you think will want to pick up this deck? Because I know a lot of people have been hyped about it, but this definitely plays different than a lot of other decks in the format. So who do you think will enjoy playing Nymris?
Any Modern or Legacy blue-white control players, any of these Miracle players. If all you want to do in Magic is take a draw step, play a land, and pass the turn, this deck is the closest thing you're going to find to that in CEDH. Other than that, kind of like I touched on before, this deck, it's extremely fun to play because it has different play patterns than most other CEDH decks. You really want to just get to the late game and do anything that you can to just get out of like these turns 1 through 3 that other decks are just, built around to utilize. I mean, Rogsai, all these Turbo Grixis decks, even these Mardu decks that are coming up, these decks are want to play the game, want to play 4-turn games or 5-turn games, and you really want to get out of that and get into the late game. And I think people who like making a lot of decisions, this isn't just the typical control cell where it's like, oh, they play I'm just going to go back to standard. They play a Hazoret, and oh, well, obviously I'm going to counter that. They play a Chandra, oh, obviously I'm going to counter that. You really have to pick and choose your counter spells and pick and choose where you use your interaction. You're playing against 3 players, you can't just fire off 1 for 1, every single chance you get. And so you're forced to make a lot of intricate decisions and really, play your deck, and you need to optimize every single card you can. And I think people who find, that sort of thing fun are really going to enjoy a deck like this.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think to your point, when you get into the late game and you have your Nymris engine online, we talked about how your counter spells are going to be they're not a 1-for-1 because you have 3 opponents, right? They're like a 1 for or a 3-to-1, right? So you're losing out. But when you have Nymris, you aren't even losing cards at all. It's basically a 0-for-1 at that point. So I think that's a really huge strength of the deck. So I think the reason a lot of people came here was that spicy Stifle in the finals. So can you give a little bit of insight onto why you stifled the fetch?
Sure. So I think before we dive into that, I kind of want to talk about my keep first because it had an impact on why I chose to stifle. So my keep was 3 lands, Stifle, Mana Drain, and Toxic Deluge, and Mystical Tutor. And that seems like a very slow keep, but the hand was kept on the strength of Toxic Deluge in the matchup. But if you look at how the hand plays out, I want to be Mana Draining on turn 2 and playing a turn 3 Nymris into a turn 4 Toxic Deluge. each turn I would be using my mana, or if I didn't use my mana fully, I wouldn't have the blue source or the blue pip to properly, utilize the Stifle in between any of those turns. So part of it was turn one, turn one was effectively my only chance to use the Stifle, at least within the first 5 turns of the game. Secondly, it was very pod dependent. I talked about how I kept the Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge is a card that, can basically take out the tie-in player, at least set him back significantly. Toxic Deluge also sets back the Winota player. Wait, Winota? No, it was Najeela. Toxic Deluge also considerably sets back the Najeela player, especially since she mulled to 3. If you have a Najeela player mulling to 3, you can almost guarantee that this is for a turn 2 or turn 1 Najeela, keeping something like land Mana Crypt or land, City Trader's Ancient Tomb, which is what the Najeela player ended up doing. And so when you think about how my plan is to play this Toxic and eventually turn the corner, the only deck that's left that would be a threat is your deck, Freedom Waffle, your Thrastargo deck. And so you combine those two facts, along with the fact that in the first turn cycle, nobody was playing anything that would enable a dockside. It just meant that, you would be the last threat remaining. I would never have an opportunity to use that Stifle again. And the main reason why Stifle is in the deck, for dockside triggers or for a Thassa's Oracle trigger, neither of those look likely at that point in the game. And so it was more of a tempo play to try to keep the only person who would reasonably be a threat after my Toxic Deluge 3 turns later, and just take him out of the game, or at least hinder them slightly in the early turns. So that was why I used the Stifle there. It was also, when I kept the hand, I didn't keep this hand based on a turn 1 Stifle. This was, after the Najeela player started to mold down to 3, and after nobody played a Mana Rock on turn 1.
Absolutely. And honestly, this kind of brings up another point is the Brewer's advantage is huge with your Nymris deck, because the reason I didn't fetch main phase, which I almost always do, and ironically I thought I was going to regret it when I didn't, but I was playing around a Mulda 3 Dark Ritual Op Agent by Najeela, right? So I waited for your fetch, and obviously I can't respond to your fetch because I need to see if Najeela is going to Dark Red Op Agent, and then I waited for Tyam to fetch so that you didn't have the Dark Red Op Agent, but obviously the Stifle got me instead. So I think that was a great call in the game, and it definitely slowed me down. So I'm all on board. So from here, I want to jump into the deck itself. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about your card choices. Right off the bat, let's just go ahead and talk about your creature suite. So you definitely have a couple of creatures here that are super spicy and not seen in a lot of other decks. We have Shieldred. Why don't we just start with the spiciest one? Do you want to elaborate on the choice of Shieldred?
Yeah, so Shieldred first is, I think, just underrated. The non-token creature aspect of each opponent's sacrifices comes up a lot. In one of my games, I was playing against a Tevesh and another Najeela, and Shieldred was just able to snipe both of their commanders because the rest of their creatures were tokens. So each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. You can almost view this effect as like a mini board wipe, and so that definitely lowers the initial kind of shock at playing something 5 mana sorcery speed that doesn't immediately win the games, because for the same mana cost we can be playing Adnos, and so we're not playing Adnos, and so it's definitely interesting. The other reason why I play Shieldred is this deck does not win the game fast. Obviously we can have those early Thoracle draws, but you're going to go to time a lot. You're going to, in your at-home games, you're going to be going, to 2-hour, 3-hour games, and you can't do that in a 90-minute round. And Shieldred was added as something that could win me the game, or was like another win con that wouldn't be countered by instant speed or the instant sorcery counters. And overall, it also answers one of the toughest matchups for this deck, which is Tivit. Tivit just beats Nymris in combat, and is one of the few decks that can actually outgrind Nymris, or at least keep up with it, due to all the clues it makes. And so having an effect that gets around the War 3 from Tivit, and you're going to see that a couple more times in this deck. definitely teched against Tivit because I knew it was going to be a problem.
Awesome. So there's a few other spicy includes. So Nimble Obstructionist. Obviously, this is in here mostly for the cycling ability. But yeah, why go so hard on the stifles in this deck?
So kind of like I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to be able to counter Tyam, counter Kinnan, counter Sisay. And one thing that those decks do is sometimes they just really don't care about your counter spells. And so part of playing control is you have to be flexible and you have to adapt to certain situations. And Nimble Obstructionist and these other stifle effects are kind of answers to those. The fact that, Tyam just does not need to cast a spell once it gets its engine online is crazy. And so there's multiple times I think everybody's experienced that Tyam opponent that where you're just sitting there with 3 counter spells in hand and you're just like, what can I do against this? Additionally, Nimble Obstructionist is kind of a gotcha card. I don't think many people are gonna be expecting this, especially the fact that Nimble Obstructionist can get around silence effects or grand abolisher effects. That's really one unique aspect of the card. It's also one of my own, personal favorite pack cards. I've stifled, or I've countered some Oblivion Stone activations from Tron players in Modern. So it's definitely a personal pack card. That's it could be cut.
All right, sounds good. I want to jump into Spellskite. I've been seeing this pop up a lot more in Kinnan decks because this is a really, really good answer to which card you have, Orcish Bowmasters. Is this a tech against Orcish Bowmasters, or what is Spellskite doing in this deck?
Spellskite is just a mother of runes. Sometimes it can, disrupt different combos, but in general, just the ability to politic and, if somebody tries to go for a win on even one of your opponent's tax pieces, and the fact that you can, change it to Spellskite is a huge thing. I think Spellskite just in general is just an underrated card, and should probably see a lot more play. Additionally, a lot of people are labeling this as a control deck. This is I won't take away from that, but this is also a tempo deck. If your Nymris dies, that's 7 mana. That's insanely that's it's hard to achieve 7 mana in a CEDH game, no matter how controlling you are, and you really never want to be recasting it. And so Spellskite just being an effect that both prevents some combos from happening, protects your opponent's stacks pieces, because that's actually a key feature of this deck. Most stacks pieces you are completely fine to have in play. Things like rule of laws, things like only drawing 1 card per turn. These things do not affect our deck in the slightest, and they prevent all these combo players from overwhelming us with too many instances or too many win attempts on 1 turn. And so Spellskite is just kind of being an underrated card that can protect different pieces. I think it's definitely earned its spot in the deck. And it's overall, I think, just a card that should see more CEDH play.
Absolutely. I think that's a great reason. Also, I think that's a really, really good point about Nymris and stacks pieces. Even in the finals match, there was a couple of rule of laws that came down while you were way ahead, and both the Najila player, Jay, and I were protesting it right away because we understood that you just need to cast 1 spell. You just want to cast 1 spell on each of our turns because that's how you get your card advantage. And if all of us can only cast 1 spell, it's really hard to stop your counter spells, right? You can just counter every single thing we do. So I think that's a really good point. One last little not CDH staple that I want to talk about is Brazen Borrower. And first off, I think I definitely see the utility here and I see why it's in. It is really funny seeing this as obviously a legacy card, a legacy sideboard card. But yeah, you want to tell them why you're running Brazen Borrower?
Brazen Borrower just ends up being 2 Nymris triggers when you need it. The deck can refill itself, but you're gonna run out of cantrips eventually. And the fact that Brazen Borrower can trigger Nymris on 2 different turns is a unique effect. I was even looking into, I won't say think twice was ever in the considering board, but I was just looking for effects like that, something like Cling to Dust, where you can constantly be casting this instant speed spell repeatedly. Just it ends up being a good effect. You want to be able to answer random permanents on the board that either got down under your counter spells, or that just things are going to resolve, and you're not going to be able to counter everything. And so having these bounce effects are just good things. And I think a lot of people might know that backup win con is just 3-1 flyer beats. They get there some portion of the time, and control decks become a lot better when 1 or 2 players are eliminated. If you can make this a 1v1, I'd say Nymris has a pretty good shot at winning most 1v1s in the format.
Fantastic. And the last creature I think is worth noting, which everyone has been talking about, but I think is a really, really powerful include for Nymris and made the deck better. Orcish Bowmasters. So obviously Flash Speed gives you a Nymris trigger, but how do you feel this card has been performing in the deck?
Bowmasters has been pretty good, I would say. I think there was a lot of hype surrounding the card, and I think deservedly so. It's an incredibly powerful card, one of the few cards that makes people stop drawing off of their heuristic study. That being said, I think it's a little bit overhyped. There are plenty of games where all Bowmasters does is it comes down, pings something, people stop drawing for a turn, and then it gets metamorph or phantasmal image and then killed off itself. I think there's a lot of hype around the card, but by no means is it overpowered in this deck. I think overall it's definitely going to affect how the format works. I think a lot of these older cards, something like Loyal Apprentice out of Blue Farm, or any of these like 1 toughness kind of creatures that would used to just sit and play and generate value, a lot of them are less good in a Bowmasters meta when up to 4 people at the table are playing this, are almost guaranteed to be playing this card that just can ping things down.
That's a fantastic point. And so moving to your sorceries, I think on that note, you mentioned that it's not been an overperformer, and I think part of that is the fact that you don't run any wheels in your Notion Thief Bowmasters deck. And I know in a control deck you don't want to be refilling your opponent's hand, but is there anything else to it? Did you consider wheels with Notion Thief and Orcish Bowmasters?
Yeah, I considered wheels. I just think that they go against what Nymris is trying to do. Unless you have a Notion Thief or a Bowmasters out, that's like a wheel is the last thing that you even want to happen in the game. Nymris does not generate insane amount of mana. Nymris also, it's kind of a kind of a joke that Nymris is going to have all the answers, or we're packing 3 counter spells, for everything, or like assume that Nymris always has 5 counter spells in hand. That's not the case. I think the deck only plays about 15 counter spells. Off of a wheel we can expect to maybe draw 1, maybe 2, maybe a third one off Nymris. Giving your opponents 21 possible cards that need to be countered and need to be answered is just a horrible feeling. So I think obviously, there's going to be times where like you resolve a Notion Thief and you have a tutor effect and you just want to go mystical tutor for that wheel and just shut everybody out of the game. But I think overall they're not great cards. When they don't support what Nymris wants to do for a game plan, and I think that's really important. Having just individually solid cards that support your game plan or do what your deck is trying to do, I think is not something that people consider enough in deck building.
I think that's a fantastic point. So your sorceries, obviously a lot of what you want to be doing is instant speeds. You don't have too many, and most of these are pretty standard and just good cards. But the one that I don't see very often, or actually I don't think I've ever seen this card before in my life, is Languish. Just another Toxic Deluge, costs 1 more mana, but it looks like this is just an effect that you just want more of. Is that why Languish is in the deck?
Yeah, completely. I talked about how good board wipes are earlier, and I just stick by that. I'll say that one of the major game plans or one of the major play patterns with this deck is you're able to stall out the game somewhat, just survive the early turns, like I said, and then you play a board wipe and just start turning the corner. This happened, I think in the majority of my wins during the Swiss and the finals, or like the semifinals, is board wipes are really how you turn the corner in decks like these. And they're just so good and so impactful in what I would say is a creature-centric meta right now. And I think if your deck can utilize board wipes, you should be playing multiples of them. They're just effects that you want to have, and you can't always, take the time to, tutor them and get them next turn. You need to have them when you need to have them, and there's no substitution for a good timely board wipe. That this is, the 8 for 1 that Control really needs to be playing to keep up in a 4-player pod.
Fantastic. Also, again, we've talked about this before, but Nymris is a 1/6. It just doesn't die. So I think that's a great point. All right. Well, now this is the most important part of the deck, the bread and butter of Nymris. You run 32 instants. I think there's definitely a lot to talk about here. So why don't we just start at the beginning? I think Born Upon the Wind is definitely an interesting card, and actually not a card I would expect in this list, though I can see its utility. Right away, the reason I wouldn't expect it is because most of your stuff already has flash. But at the same time, it's just another cantrip plus Nymris trigger, which means it's card advantage. Do you want to give a little more insight onto why this card was chosen?
Yeah, it was definitely it got added to the deck kind of last minute, but I think the ability to win at instant speed or win on top of somebody is definitely a unique effect, and you can also definitely surprise people. When somebody just assumes, oh yeah, the Nymris player is just holding up counter magic, and then maybe they go to develop something, and you can just flash out a win. Or Born Upon the Wind also works very well with board wipes, or very well with these Graph Diggers effects.
Right.
So you don't even need to say that like even if it's not hitting the majority of the cards in your deck, the ones that it does hit are super impactful. And additionally, just the floor to just playing 2-mana draw card trigger Nymris, it's not great. We don't want that effect, but that's the floor. Makes this a perfectly serviceable card in the deck.
Fantastic. I think that's a great explanation. So moving on, obviously you're going to run your suite of cantrips, even though these are not CEDH staples. I think everyone understands that that's what you need to do. They get you 2 cards because of Nymris rather than the normal 1. So let's talk about one more general concept in here. You run a good amount of 2-mana counter spells. One thing that I do in my decks personally is I avoid 2-mana interaction at all costs. I've cut Muddle the Mixture, I've cut Mana Drain, Delay, Counterspell. I don't run any of it. But obviously this is a different type of deck. How do you feel 2-mana counterspells have been performing in this deck? And do you see any downside, or do you think that running this many is good?
There's definitely a cost to playing them. The fact that some people can be playing, when we could be playing Dispel and we're playing Counterspell and we're countering instants a lot of the time, it's definitely a cost. But I think a huge amount of playing Control is just having the flexibility to answer what you need to. I also will say, I'll reiterate, a lot of decks, they want to be, like playing something like a Lotho on turn 2, or playing a Drannith Magistrate on turn 2. We don't have a lot of those effects that require us to, tap out in the early turns or play like a 2-drop, hold up a 1-drop counterspell. We are really just trying to survive the early turns, and that's why we can kind of afford to be a little bit less mana efficient, because our goal is just get to the end game or get to the late game, or at least at the bare minimum just get out of the early game, because that is not when our deck is performing well and not when we want to be interacting. So it's it's kind of a factor of Control needs to be able to have flexible counter magic, and additionally 2-mana counter spells, or like being able to counter creatures, is a huge thing. A lot of people will say like, oh, Tivit will just cost 2 more, and like, they'll generate treasures one time. If you counter it, that thing's costing 8 mana and it didn't make 2 treasures. And when you counter Atraxa, that thing costed 7 mana. It's going up to 9 mana now. Countering, a lot of times people will keep hands that all the hands do is power out an Ad Nauseam, or power out a Tivit, or power out their commander. And being able to just have the counterspell for those cards, when they're investing, a Mana Vault or a Jeweled Lotus into those cards, Counterspell is effectively like a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 there. You're getting, when the fact that these people are Lotus pedaling and Dark Ritualing out their commanders, just being able to counterspell them, it kind of takes away from the 1-for-1 aspect of counterspell that I talked about as a weakness in a four-person format.
Absolutely. And I think, so just from my own experience, one of the weaknesses of my 1-mana counterspell suite is, in Dargo Thrasios, is Grand Abolisher, Ranger Captain. Those cards are, you just can't beat them. Not if they're played with the same turn win. And so I think being able to actually answer those threats is huge, especially in a deck that you really want to be playing the long game, and you're bound to see some of those cards pop up eventually. And if you just can't beat them, well, what is your control deck good for, right? So I think this is definitely an important meta call. So jumping into some of the other, we're seeing again a lot of cards we don't normally see in CEDH. Right away, Dig Through Time. I think this looks like a fantastic card in the deck because it's really 2 mana. You're gonna look at 9 cards because of your Nymris trigger, and you draw 3. And your graveyard is gonna be full as long as it's not very early game. How has this card been performing?
I mean, if you've never, you haven't lived till you've cast a Dig Through Time. Like this card, people might be able to tell from some of the choices in my deck that I played kind of Esper Dragons, or they might see the Languish, they might see the Dig Through Time. This card is just a house. I think it's not seeing as much play because of Ad Nauseam, and there's definitely a cost to not being able to play this spell in the early turns, and you're not always going to get your fetch lands in the yard. You're not always going to have cantrips to fuel delve like you are in 60 card formats. But this card is just the ultimate value piece. I mean, like you said, just looking top 9, taking 3. I mean, it's so incredible for only 2 mana most of the time because your Nymris feeds your own graveyard. One of my favorite cards in the deck by far, easily.
Fantastic. Another 60 card format staple is Drown in the Lock. Do you want to talk about this card a little bit?
I think it just kind of goes over the flexibility that I was talking about. Your things are going to resolve, and you want to be able to have answers for them. This card killed a Displacer Kitten. This card was able to then counter a Manglehorn in the finals that would have blown up my Grafdigger's Cage. This card just screams flexibility, and obviously there's going to be times where this can't counter what you needed to counter because of the graveyard restriction, but we're planning on playing a long game anyways, and so that's this card, there's definitely a cost to it, but flexibility is key in a control deck, I'll say.
Yeah, fantastic. Shadow of Doubt. This is another card I don't think I've ever seen before this deck. This thing seems sweet. Not only does it, again, draw 2 cards, just stifling a tutor. How has this performed?
This has performed fine. Like, I can't stop reiterating that counter spells aren't enough currently in this format. If a Sisei gets on the battlefield, they don't care. If a Kinnan gets on the battlefield, they don't care. And so having these different effects that can, stop these random tutor effects from these as activated abilities is so important. Not only that, the card is, again, like I said, kind of with Born Upon the Wind, the floor to it is not that low. Paying 2 mana to draw a card, trigger Nymris is not the worst. And there's times when you're just going to randomly catch people's fetch lands, or it's just going to randomly catch a demonic tutor or something like that. This is what the deck wants to be doing, I take that back. This is just an effect that the deck needs. You need to have diversity within your answers, otherwise you're just going to get run over by the format's diversity and the threats that it can provide.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good way to put it. And speaking of diversity, you have another card that we don't see in CEDH, Sheoldred's Edict. This is so cool because it's we've been talking so much about this 1-to-1 counter spells just not being enough, but this is almost always going to be a 3-for-1. So this card seems like an all-star. Is that how it's been performing?
Yeah, if any card has been overperforming, it was Sheoldred's Edict. This card is a house. This card, like I said kind of earlier about Shieldred, this randomly, hits some commanders like Tevish, like Najila, and like Urza. And it also, it gets around Tivit, which is, again, one of the hardest matchups in this deck. And the fact that it doesn't put you down on cards, you can choose exactly how you want to play it, when you want to play it, and it almost acts as like a mini instant speed board wipe effect. That's like the unique part about this. I think this card, and it also has random utility of not being able to, be flickered by Displacerkin, and so it's one of the best answers to killing a Displacerkin. It can't be, deflecting swatted to something else. This card is just, I think it's very underrated, and it probably should see more play, especially if you're having trouble dealing with Tivit. I mean, it's just one of the cleanest answers.
So moving on, we've talked a bit about Stifle. I think we've kind of got your thoughts on why you need these Stifle effects in the format. But one last card, and I think this is the coolest instant that you have in your deck. It's Visions of Beyond, literal ancestral recall in Commander. Has this been a 1-mana cantrip, or has this been performing as an ancestral recall more of the time?
I think half the time it's 1-mana cantrip, and the other time, half the time it's ancestral. The Nymris deck itself, like you said, it fills its graveyard. And I kind of want to draw your attention how this and Dig Through Time are cards that, utilize Nymris's graveyard, the fact that it sends cards to the graveyard without disrupting Grafdiggers and Weathered Runestone. But yeah, Visions of Beyond is one of the sweetest cards in the deck. And I kind of want to go back to the floor of the card. Again, just 1 mana, draw a card, trigger your Nymris is not a bad floor to have. And the fact that you also have a lot of tie-in decks, a lot of these Brain Freeze decks, a lot of these decks that just will randomly, again, over the course of the game, fill their graveyard with cards. This card is going to, take advantage of that. And, 1 mana, trigger Nymris, draw 3 is just, that's Dig Through Time numbers right there. Like, these are the effects that we want to see. And I can't reiterate, the floor is not that low, so there's not that much, you're not losing out too much by putting this in your deck.
Fantastic. I think that's all I want to cover for the instance, so let's go ahead and go down to the artifacts. Obviously, you're going to have your suite of ramp. You don't go overboard here, which I like. But you have Curse Totem, Grafdigger's Cage, Weathered Runestone. So we've talked about Grafdigger's Cage and Weathered Runestone a little bit, so I think let's go ahead and skip over those. But Curse Totem, has this been a overperformer, underperformer? How has this been?
This has been an overperformer. I think, compared to Grafdiggers and Weathered Runestone, it's definitely the worst of the three. But, we don't have any activated abilities. I guess actually Shieldred, but we don't have too many relevant activated abilities. This doesn't hit that much. Or like this hits a decent amount of cards in the format, and when it's good, it's one of the most suppressive stacks pieces out there, and will just completely neuter decks. And like I said, I built this deck to target 3 things: Kinnan, Sisay, and Taya. And this just, they don't want to play the game when this comes out. Absolutely.
And speaking from experience as a Dargo Thrasios player, Curse Totem not only shuts down our mana dorks, it shuts down our main grind engine. While Thrasios isn't always great, it is our fallback plan, and we use it quite a lot. So Curse Totem just means that, like, even those extra couple cards we'd get to look at, now all of a sudden we're just left with 1 and 2 cards in hand, and we're really not doing much. So I think this is really impressive. And just one more note, Grafdigger's Cage and Weathered Runestone, they also stop all of the into play tutors, the pod effects, the Court of Callings, the Finale of Devastation, the Green Sun Zenith, all of that. Those X green tutors be shut down, and in Dargo Thrasios, that's a huge part of the deck. So I think these are great choices, and you're not going overboard either. So I think that's awesome.
These are also kind of effects where these 1 cards end up like kind of almost taking out, possibly like 5 cards, 6 cards combined in your opponent's hands. These pieces. This is why I highlight the board wipe effects and these effects so much. This is how you generate your card advantage as a control deck in CEDH. You can't do it through 1 for 1ing. You need these cards that like 6 for 1 or like 5 for 1 off of 1 card, and this is how you generate control advantage as a control deck. you need to generate it here because you just can't afford to 1-for-1 constantly.
Absolutely. And speaking in another card that gains you card advantage, a very spicy one, Dystopia. So how has Dystopia been performing? Has this been dead in some hands, or is it has there been enough of green or white permanents that this has just been an all-star?
This is an all-star. You know, it's definitely hard. You know, I never like to tap out for 3 mana. For me, if I'm tapping out for 3 mana, the bar's got to be pretty high. But Dystopia hits that. You know, I said earlier how Tivit is a hard matchup. Just it beats us in combat, grinds as well as us. Dystopia is like one of the perfect answers to Tivit. But I've had turn cycles where it's like, you know, Dystopia just eats 3 things. I pay 1 life for it. It eats another 3 things. You know, this card just sits on the board and it makes these green decks not want to ever play the game, especially after a board wipe. You know, I said one of the major play patterns to this deck is board wipe and then, you know, gain control of the game and start taking over. Dystopia ensures that any green deck after a board wipe, they are not coming back from it.
Absolutely. One more thing to talk about here is Steel Enchantment. I can imagine you struggle against Mystic Remoras and Rhystic Studies from your opponents. Is that what this is teching against?
Yeah, we really don't like when an opponent has Rhystic Study, more so than most other decks, because our win involves Thassa's Oracle, and we don't have silence effects to back this up currently. And so when your opponent just has just as many counterspells as you, it's very hard. So Steel Enchantment is just one of our best answers to Rhystic Study. You know, we can balance it with, you know, Brazen Power and Sightgriff, but this is one of the most clean answers. You know, if we could play Red Blast, I would play. I don't know how many I'd play, but you know, this is what we're dealt the hand of blue and black, and we gotta make it work. So Steel Enchantment's in the deck.
Love it. Awesome. So we're down to lands. There's just a couple things to talk about here. Number 1, Minamo, School at Water's Edge. Is this a sneak peek for the One Ring, or is there another good reason, just untapping Nymris? What's this in here for?
I couldn't figure out a better land to put in. Yeah. There are definitely future iterations that might be playing One Ring. And obviously you can do like some amount of mini politicking, untapping other people's lands.
Yep.
If I'm being honest, I don't know. This could
better than a basic island.
Yeah. You don't want to play, or we're already playing 2 basic islands.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Rivendell. This is a new card from Lord of the Rings. So this is just another control-y land, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I'll say that kind of like I said in the back to the counterspell suite is we're not a deck that, you know, really. Compared to other decks, we're not taking advantage of our early turns as much, and so the opportunity cost to play a tap land on turn 1, it's not as high as it is in other decks. You know, I couldn't imagine playing, you know, any like Xander's Lounge or anything like that in almost any deck in the format. But you know, when you're playing draw go control, you can afford to, you know, have 1 land in your deck come in tapped. It's also just, you know, a great way to sink mana into once you have Nymris in play, or like, you know, once you're doing the Nymris grind thing. You know, Castle Ventress is a card that has seen, you know, playing many of these controlling standard decks, and there's a reason for it. Scry 2 is pretty good.
Absolutely. There's only 2 more things to talk about, I think, and that is Cabal Pit and Cephalid Coliseum. I think this is a great choice. Again, you have thresholds so often, like a lot of decks that want to run these lands don't. Have these felt like just pain lands, or have they been performing?
Oh, they've been performing. You know, I had a notion to even play in Cephalid Coliseum with somebody. That felt good.
Brutal. Even Bowmasters as removal if you really need it.
Yep. And then Cabal Pit is also kind of like you mentioned. This is another answer to Grand Abolisher. You know,
right.
And being able to you know, kill these various things. So yeah, the utility lands that's one good thing about being able to play 2 colors is you can afford to play lands like these, lands like Urza Saga, and you're not too heavily punished for it.
Yep, absolutely. So here is my comparison between the list that I came up with and then your current iteration of the list. And so I just kind of want to hear your thoughts. This is, and I'll kind of go over it a little bit as well. Yeah, so I just had a couple different meta choices. I wanted to be able to run one wheel to search for, so I added a Time Twister. Though, in hindsight, maybe this could be Windfall because we love graveyards. And then Dothy I felt like was a good fit for this deck, just another way to shut off graveyards. And Snuff Out Submerge, they just feel like such great instant speed removal. And the One Ring, this seems like just such a powerhouse, especially since we're already running Malmo. And yeah, so well, let's just start with these. How do you feel about, like, are you super opposed to one Time Twister in the deck? Do you think it would lower the card quality that much?
No. I mean, one card isn't gonna do anything for like considerably. And I do think the fact that we're playing Vamp Tutor, we're playing Mystical, we're playing Imp Seal, having ability to access a tutor, especially, let's say we mull down to 4 and our out is, like Land, Mana Crypt, Time Twister, it's definitely a card. And especially I see the fact that you're adding Narset. Narset was definitely a consideration. In fact, the majority of your cards were considerations in the deck. Yeah, I can definitely see a package like this, and I'll probably be toying with something like this in the future.
Fantastic. Snuff Out and Submerge. Was there a reason that these didn't make the cut?
Yeah, looking back, I have no idea why Submerge isn't in the deck. That card is just a house and does everything you want it to. Actually, that kind of goes on to a point that I want to talk about. My list was not tuned in the slightest. I brought like 10 cards to the tournament, which I had never even played with. And, before that, I had only played a handful of games with this deck. So I really encourage, I think there's the core that I talked about a bit, using Gravediggers and the board wipes is important, but I really encourage anybody and everybody to be, innovating on this list or trying new cards. And I think that's one thing that's good about Nymris is that you can kind of tune it to how you want. And so, I don't know why I wasn't running Submerge or the One Ring, if I'm being honest. Those seem like just crazy plays that I.
So you think the One Ring will be a Nymris staple moving forward?
I'd have to assume so. Like, this card just does everything we want it to. I'm against playing things that, in most of my decks, if I pay 3 mana for something, I want it to immediately impact the board. But the One Ring, this card just feels bonkers. I don't know why I didn't put it in the deck. So yeah.
Fair enough. I've seen this just doing work in so many decks, and in the controller archetype, it just feels like it's going to be So one other thing, and this is something that I got from another deck that I'll be showing, but Runaway Together. We've all this whole interview been talking about how you want more than a 1-for-1 effect. And also, notably, one thing that came up in our game, and I think your semifinals game, if I'm not mistaken, was not being able to bounce your Thassa's Oracle. Do you think that having an effect like Runaway Together would be worth adding for that reason, and also just using it as a dual removal spell?
I definitely think so. Not being able to bounce Thassa's, with the exception of Otawara, or being able to get it back with Takenuma, there's a huge cost to that. I will say that we're already playing 2 bounce effects in kind of Sagrift and Brazen Borrower, and Nymris is a deck where you can't just bounce something. You can't just bounce a Problematica permanent and end the game very quickly afterwards. We're a control deck, and I constantly found myself bouncing something only to have to deal with it the next turn. And the fact that I was already playing 2 bounce effects, I started to cut things like Snap from the deck, and that's why you don't see a card like Snap, which I think people would instinctively gravitate towards it in a deck like this. That being said, playing another one of these effects, it's very powerful, and being able to return our own Thassa's to hand is it came up a bunch of different times in the tournament. You know, the fact that Thassa's is really our only win con, and so when it gets snuffed, it makes it hard. You know, we might be going on 3-1 Flash Fire beats then.
Exactly.
Or stealing Dargas off of Gilded Drakes. So I can definitely see a card like this.
Okay, fantastic. Last thing I want to talk about between these two changes, I believe you're running 32 lands in your list, and I personally just felt like that was a little too much. Though I can understand why this deck just wants to hit land drops, and that's the main plan. I felt like one more ramp piece and cutting 2 lands was where I wanted to go. Obviously, Dimir Signet is definitely a worse piece of ramp. You can't hold up your 1-mana counter spells or 1-mana interaction. But how do you feel about the land count? Is this something that you'd want to revisit in the future?
Me personally, I'm like, I just think that playing more land, people need to be playing more lands in deck just in general. But I think especially in a control deck, you know, when hitting your land drop is so crucial to what the deck wants to do, and just having consistent sources of mana, I've enjoyed playing higher land counts in my deck. That being said, you know, I won't fault anybody for cutting, you know, some lands and you know, playing more ramp and trying to have a little bit more explosion out of the early game turns. But from a personal standpoint, I think, you know, not hitting your 4th land drop or like any of your lands leading up to 4 is I'm almost gonna say death sentence, because this is what the deck wants to be doing. It wants to like have 6-7 lands in play, you know, by turn 6 or 7, and utilize all of that mana on each turn.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's jump into your spicy new Nymris. So this is the preview of changes between your old version and your new version post tournament. So I just want to talk a little bit about where you're moving with the direction of this list right away. Obviously, I do see the One Ring, I do see Signet, but looks like you only cut 1 land in this version versus I cut 2. So I like that change. But yeah, let's the One Ring. Have you had a chance to test with it?
I have not tested this version yet. So all these are just kind of changes that I made after the tournament. And some of them, I'll be honest, they're purely tests, right? You know, I don't think Soul Shatter is you know, I don't think it's going to have a home in the deck, but I want to find out, and I want to figure this out. And so don't take any of these changes kind of as like, oh, these must be in the deck. But I think you can kind of see where I wanted to go with this. Submerge, Subtlety, they should have been in the deck to start with. And Limb Duel's Vault was kind of I think Limb Duel's Vault, you can almost see this as the counterpart to Shieldred. You know, instead of playing a separate win con, just being able to more consistently get to our Thassa's, I think is the idea behind Limb Duels. And then I want to test between Malevolent Hermit and Conqueror's Veil. I think, you know, it's important to have a silence effect and being able to just push through your combo, especially the fact that, you know, multiple times, like you said, I ended up with a Thassa's on board and I didn't win the game. And so making sure that happens less is, I think, you know, my own personal answer to that situation that happened twice. And I don't know how to feel about Arcane Denial. I do think that having it cost is less color intensive than Counterspell. This is definitely a cost. I think people don't recognize how color intensive this deck is. You know, almost to the point where I'm really considering if Ancient Tomb has a point in the deck, has a spot in the deck. But you know, colored pips are not easy to come by in a deck that wants to be casting a spell on each of your opponent's turns every single turn cycle. And so I think that's a change I'm going to test out to see, you know, how if that's a good change.
Absolutely. And obviously there is some synergy here, which you won't always have, but you have Notion Thief and you have Orcish Bowmaster, so they might not want to draw 2. The floor is not that low. I mean, the floor, again, because of your Nymris, you're going to be drawing 2, and then for your opponent's drawing 2. So it's the floor is not the lowest ever, and then the ceiling is very high. So I like that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump to some notable exclusions and cards that we're considering. So right off the bat, this came up earlier, ad nauseum. How do you feel about ad nauseum in the deck, and is this something that other people should try?
I am personally not a fan of it. I think that, you know, there's a large opportunity cost, you know, trying to go for an ad nauseum and then it not working, and now you've tapped out of 5 mana when you're at the control deck, who's trying to keep the table sane. In addition, you know, there's some serious costs. You can't play dig through time. You can't play other, you know, expensive things. And I think the final reason why I'm not playing ad nauseum is just, this is not a deck where you can main phase in ad nauseum once you've seen a window. This is, you know, we're not playing any of the fast mana. We're not playing anything like Breach or Dockside, which is just, you know, an insane hit off of an ad nauseum. And none of that, people can just, you know, let your ad nauseum resolve, let you go down, you know, 20-30 life, and then just, you're probably not going to have mana for your follow-up win if you're going for your Thassa's, if you manage to find it. And so it leaves you open in a lot of different ways. And I think one notable thing is, you know, by just saying I don't play ad nauseum in my deck, you know, don't attack me, attack the other black player, there's a serious upside to being able to say that, you know, in your deck construction or at any pod. You know, your control deck, your life total does matter. I think this is kind of like it's a common, like, kind of new player cycle where it's like they think that life total is like the only thing that matters, and then you get better at the game and you learn life total is a resource and you should use it, but then like you kind of do another 180 and then life total is a resource. Like don't just, you know, expend it out for free just by putting one card in your deck. You're just going to naturally, you know, have 10 less life in any given game, just on average or something like that. So that's why ad nauseum is in the deck for me. That being said, I think, you know, with any of these considering piles, I don't have a reanimator package in here, but it should be in here. You know, this deck is highly flexible. I would say I made a version where there's only, you know, I think 73 cards in it, which I think are the core cards that really shouldn't be cut. Other than that, there is so much flexibility to any individual card in the deck and any different versions of the deck. You know, I think we'll talk about that in a sec, but, you know, we touched on it earlier. You can run a wheel package, you can run a reanimator package, you can run this ad nauseum package and try to go for a more turbo and find your windows and go for wins quicker.
Awesome. I think that's some great explanation. Next, I'm sure people have seen this list and wondered why Counterbalance is not in the list. It seems like a natural, it does the type of thing that you want to be doing. What's your reason for excluding Counterbalance?
I would say Counterbalance is like, it honestly could easily see, I could easily see a version that plays Counterbalance. I didn't like Counterbalance because I didn't like revealing all of my cards off of it. You know, we do have some synergy with Nymris and being able to like reveal a card, it doesn't work, and then, you know, draw it and replace the top. But I didn't like how everybody was like seeing all the counter spells and then in my hand, and then, you know, when there's a scary, you know, threat on the stack, you know, it's always going to get passed to me because, you know, you have revealed information. I think that's a definite cause to Counterbalance. That being said, the effect is so strong, and, you know, it kind of works under a Grand Abolisher, so to speak, or at least, you know, Grand Abolisher players can't feel safe when there's a Counterbalance in play before they go for the combo. And I'm going to be testing versions of the deck, and I think that it definitely has a spot in the deck, or at least is very heavily worth considering.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Torpor Orb. This is another similar stacks effect to your Curse Totem, your Grafdigger's Cage. It's just another artifact that shuts down a wide variety of strategies, and so it can be considered more than a 1-for-1. How do you like Torpor Orb? Is this something that might see play in the future?
It definitely could. You know, we live in a Dockside world, and being any answer that we can play to shut that down is huge. The big thing is just this stops our combo, and there's going to be times when we need to turn the corner, and like I said, we don't have a great many ways to bounce our own things. So the fact that this stops us from winning, and we don't have the best tools to just immediately get rid of it ourselves, or, you know, sacrifice it some way or the other, that's the reason why it's not in the deck. But, you know, if we start to play more bounce spells, or, you know, putting Chain of Vapors in our deck, or we're just going to assume that, nobody else can win through this, so it's going to get removed eventually. I could see it. But for now, I have it in the considering pile.
Fair enough. I think the last card to talk about here is Laboratory Maniac, just as a backup Thassa's Oracle. Is this a potential include, or do you just think you don't need two of those effects?
Yeah, I've seen some talk, but I just don't think you need two of that effect. I think Thassa's is just head and shoulders above Labman. Nobody's contesting that, but the fact that you have to draw a card, and that's very scary if you can't immediately trigger it on your own turn. And we do have cantrips, so it makes it easier. But yeah, I think Thassa's is a clean enough win con, and Mnemonic Betrayal in long games gets there most of the time. When you're stealing other people's Underworld Breaches and all of their cards, they're probably going to have a Thassa's too. I think I'd probably, before I played Labman, I'd probably play something like a Praetor's Grasp to even grab my opponent's Thassa before I play this card.
All right, so regarding Mulligans, I don't think we're going to go over any sample hands today, but do you want to just talk about like what you're looking for in your Mulligans?
Yeah, so obviously we're playing blue. Any fish or any Ristic Study is what we want to see. That being said, and we're obviously playing our fast broken mana. Soul Rings, Mana Crypts, anything like that to get us ahead and play early Nymris is insane. Same with Mana Vault. All those, and Jewel Lotus, those provide turn 2, turn 3 Nymrises, and that can really generate the card advantage. I think when it becomes hard is when you see cards that are, teched specifically against what your opponents can be doing. So, like I said earlier, in the finals, I kept essentially a hand that was, 3 lands and a Toxic Deluge, and that was the reason why I kept the hand. I think when you understand that Toxic Deluge is good in a matchup, you can, almost mulligan looking for something like that. Not too aggressively, but, same with keeping an opposition agent in a matchup where that's important. I think understanding matchups is the key to mulligans. And obviously, we're still playing blue, so we still have the broken hands that, turn 1, turn 2 heuristics lean us towards.
Fantastic. Awesome. So I think that's enough going over the specifics on the deck. Looking forward, do you think you'll continue playing Nymris, or do you think that, especially now that it looks like some of these tournaments are moving towards 75 minutes versus 95-minute rounds, do you think Nymris will be your deck of choice in upcoming tournaments?
I think, especially moving towards 75-minute rounds, this is, I would say it goes as far as to almost like kill the deck. Nymris, in most of my wins, I went to time, or close to it at least. Winning with like 1 to 2 minutes left on the clock. It is painfully slow how like the pace at which the deck wins. We can't force through our combo, and that is the biggest weakness of Nymris going forward. If I'm being honest, a lot of new players should really just pick up Tivit. Tivit does a lot of the same things that Nymris does with regards to the board wipe and the Grafdigger's effects plan, while also being able to, have 1-card win cons and time sieve, and being able to force through your combo with something like silence effects. And I think part of that exact those points I touched on are why we've been seeing a lot of Tivit kind of in uptick recently. That being said, Nymris, it's such a fun deck, and especially if you've played CEDH and you're just used to, just jamming, your mana quickly and just getting on the board and doing all that stuff. Nymris is a very nice change of pace. Being able to slow the game down, you're going to take a lot of decisions in the game. You're going to be able to be a player in each game, and I don't think there's a substitute in it, at least in CEDH. In 60 card formats, you can kind of find a deck like this. But I think currently, I don't plan on playing Nymris in any tournament settings. That being said, maybe in local events or less high stakes things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So obviously, I think a lot of the reason that people are drawn to this Nymris deck is that we don't see standard cards in it. It's a lot of really cool cards that are not CDH staples. So along that line, are you working on any other brews that people might be interested that you want to point them to?
Yeah, I keep on reiterating this Grafdiggers and board wipe plan. I think I touch on Tivit, right? You could take it in that. One interesting thing you could do is actually go in the complete opposite direction of control. You could play something like Slicer, right? Slicer doesn't care about, those Grafdiggers effects, and Slicer likes board wipes for keeping the path clear for it. If you agree that Grafdiggers effects are good, Slicer's but you don't really want to play control and you want to win fast, I think Slicer has a lot of viability, especially, with the One Ring, you're playing a deck that already is playing, Mishra's Workshop. What is it? Is it that is
Mishra's Workshop? Yeah, the taps for 3.
You're playing Mishra's Workshop already. The One Ring is a pretty good card, and being able to consistently power that out early is, I think, Slicer might be a little bit slept on.
Snake, thank you so much for joining me and going over this deck tech. I know a lot of people have been asking a lot of questions about this, and I think this has been at least very enlightening for me, so hopefully for everyone else as well. I will leave a link to Snake's Mox field down below, so go ahead and check out his deck and his other brews. I'll also leave a link to Nymris and his new version as well. So thank you so much for joining me, Snake.
Yeah, no problem. I'd love to be on here. I think I plan on going to the Mox Masters Invitational in this October. In addition, I'm also currently qualified for the current RCQ, I think, in Atlanta. It's going to be at the end of this year, so if any of you guys are coming to that tournament, I'm happy to meet you guys.
Right on. I'll see you at the Invitational.
Sounds good.